John Mitchell sat at the worn wooden desk in his dimly lit apartment, eyes fixed on the cracked screen of his laptop. The hum of the fluorescent light above was the only sound that broke the silence of his lonely existence. A 27-year-old with no ambitions, no goals, and no purpose beyond getting through each day, John led a life of routine. His apartment was small, tucked in a forgotten corner of the city. The walls, a dull shade of beige, felt like a prison to him. He'd never really been social, never sought out friends, and those he did have slowly drifted away as he remained static in his monotonous life. There were nights when he tried to sleep, but even then he felt as though he never truly rested. Dreamless nights were his reality. Whenever he closed his eyes, he was greeted with blackness, and it always felt as if he never even fell asleep. The days blurred together. Time had lost meaning. John didn't dream. He didn't remember his dreams, not even one. And maybe that was for the best, because deep down he knew something was missing in his life, something he couldn't grasp. It wasn't until one lonely evening that his routine was disrupted by an ad that flashed on his computer screen while he scrolled mindlessly. The words caught his attention, not because they were promising anything he truly desired, but because of the number. Security personnel needed. $12,000/week. Must sign NDA. Remote location. Immediate start. $12,000 a week. That was far more than he could make at his dead-end job. It seemed absurd to even consider, but the sheer size of the paycheck sparked something in him, a desire for change. John had never been one to take risks, but at that moment, the thought of leaving behind his dull existence for something unknown, something exciting, felt like an opportunity he couldn't pass up. He skimmed the rest of the ad, remote location. It didn't specify much more. There was something unsettling about the lack of detail. No address, no names, just a number to call for more information. But the promise of money was too enticing. With one quick motion, he clicked the apply button, his heart racing with anticipation. The next morning, he received a call. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "Hello, Mr. Mitchell. This is Father Roderick from St. Agnes Estate. We received your application. Your qualifications look good. If you're still interested, we'd like to proceed." Father Roderick's voice sounded too reassuring, like he'd spoken this script 1,000 times before. His tone was smooth but emotionless. The details were vague, but everything John needed to know was clear. Security, remote location, exceptional pay, NDA, no questions asked. "There's just one catch," Father Roderick continued. "It's a very private estate. You'll be working with minimal contact with others. It's not a traditional security role, but it's important work." John hesitated for a moment. Private estate. It seemed odd, but he had nothing to lose, and the money was too good. The silence on the phone line felt thick, almost as if the priest were waiting for John to second guess. But John didn't. "I'll take it," he said firmly, almost surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. 2 days later, John found himself standing in front of an imposing mansion, miles from civilization. The house loomed like a monolithic structure, nestled in a remote forest on the outskirts of town. The land surrounding it was untouched, the dirt road leading to it barely visible through the overgrown brush. It was isolated, almost unnaturally so. The mansion was old. Its stone walls looked like they had stood for centuries, weathered by time and neglect. The windows were dark, and the only signs of life were the faintest glow of light flickering through the cracks in the window frames. As John walked closer, A chill ran down his spine, but he dismissed it. It was just the isolated location, the lack of people. He was a security guard now, not a guest. He pushed open the heavy wooden door with a creak, and inside he was greeted by Father Roderick. The priest's appearance was as unsettling as the mansion itself. He was elderly, with deep-set wrinkles and eyes that seemed too knowing, too much like a person who had seen things others couldn't. His dark robe swished as he moved, and there was a coldness to his manner that John couldn't quite place. "I trust you found the estate well enough?" Father Roderick asked, his voice smoother now, as though expecting John to feel a sense of awe. John nodded, though he wasn't sure how to feel. The sheer size of the mansion was overwhelming, and something about it didn't feel quite right. "This will be your post for the duration of your employment," the priest said, gesturing to a small security office near the back of the house. It was dark and cramped, but it would suffice for the time being. "Before you begin your shift, I'll need you to familiarize yourself with the rules." Father Roderick handed John a rusted plaque that looked like it had been sitting in the mansion for decades. The edges were frayed and the metal seemed to have a dull sheen. The rules were etched into the surface in a foreign script, but they were also written in English underneath. 1. Never look directly into the eyes of anyone you're guarding. 2. Always speak in truth when in the house. 3. Never leave your post after midnight. 4. If you hear whispering, never follow it. 5. Mark a drop of your blood at the front gate at sundown. 6. Never ask about the other people who live here. John read the rules aloud, each one feeling more bizarre than the last. The rules were strange, yes, but nothing out of the ordinary for a private estate. At least that's what John told himself. "Do you understand?" Father Roderick asked, his voice serious now. John nodded slowly, trying to make sense of the odd phrasing. "Good," the priest said, a cold smile curling on his lips. "Now your shift begins at midnight. Don't stray from the rules, Mr. Mitchell. They are the key to your safety." John felt a strange chill at the mention of his safety, but he dismissed it. After all, he was here for the paycheck. He couldn't afford to question the details now. John began his first night shift in the mansion, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. The mansion felt alive, and the weight of its history pressed down on him. As he walked through the vast halls, his flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The air grew colder, and an odd feeling of unease settled in his chest. The mansion seemed to move around him, the hallways shifting, as if they were changing their layout when he wasn't looking. He tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered in the back of his mind. He checked his phone for the time, but the GPS had failed completely. There was no signal, no connection to the outside world. The mansion was cut off from everything, and John wondered if the ad was more than it seemed. How had they found him, and what kind of place was this? Just as John was about to report the GPS malfunction, a food delivery arrived at the back door, its contents packed neatly in boxes, but there was no delivery driver in sight. "This is odd," John muttered to himself, glancing nervously around. He knew that at some point he had to stop questioning the unexplainable things, but it was difficult to ignore the eerie feeling that was rapidly consuming him. Time and space seemed to bend in the mansion. Was it magic, a curse, or was it something worse? The strange occurrences escalated as John's night went on. The whispering sound started, soft voices coming from the walls calling his name. He froze, recalling Rule 4. He was not to follow the whispers, but something inside him screamed, "Go check it out." What had he gotten himself into? John sat at his desk late into the night, the rusted plaque Father Roderick had given him lying open in front of him. The 6 rules were etched into its surface, their words still lingering in his mind like a heavy weight. As he read them again, the rules took on an almost ritualistic significance, growing more unsettling the more he thought about them. Never look directly into the eyes of anyone you're guarding. Always speak in truth when in the house. Never leave your post after midnight. If you hear whispering, never follow it. Mark a drop of your blood at the front gate at sundown. Never ask about the other people who live here. As he went over them one by one, John couldn't shake the feeling that these rules weren't simply there to keep order. They were designed to control something. But what? What exactly was it that was being contained here? He found himself wondering if the rules were mere superstition, like old folklore, or if they were a safeguard against something far darker, something he didn't yet understand. He closed his eyes for a moment and thought about the job offer. He had signed the contract, agreed to the terms, and now he was here, surrounded by mysteries that seemed too large for his understanding. But perhaps the mansion's secrets were beyond his comprehension, beyond his ability to fathom. Maybe it was better that way. Better to just follow the rules, keep his head down, and collect the paycheck. He couldn't afford to think about it too much. But as the night wore on, an uneasy dread settled over him, gnawing at his insides. He wasn't sure what was happening, but there was something about the way these rules were written so precisely, almost as if they had been passed down for generations, like they were carved into the bones of this house. And that thought made him shudder. John began his night shift as usual, walking the corridors of the mansion, trying to stick to his patrols. The mansion was cold, but too cold, not just the temperature but the atmosphere itself. The house seemed to breathe, its walls heavy with something ancient, something alive. As he walked down the long, dimly lit hallways, John noticed something odd, strange carvings on the walls, symbols he hadn't noticed before. They weren't traditional symbols. They didn't appear to be from any recognizable language, and they didn't seem to fit the house's decor. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a trick of the shifting shadows or his exhaustion getting the better of him. But the carvings, the symbols, they seemed to change shape ever so slightly when he wasn't looking directly at them. It wasn't obvious, but if he focused just the right way, it was as though the carvings would flicker, like something was moving within them. He rubbed his eyes, but the symbols stayed the same, growing more erratic the longer he stared at them. It was as if they were shifting, altering themselves in response to his gaze. He stepped closer to examine them, running his fingers along the walls. The feeling of being watched crept up his spine, sending a chill through his body. He quickly turned away, brushing it off as tiredness. He hadn't slept in days. The mansion was too quiet, too isolated. Maybe it was just the darkness playing tricks on his mind. But that gnawing feeling, the one that told him he was not alone, wouldn't go away. He wasn't sure if he was seeing things or if the house itself was beginning to affect his senses, but there was a growing unease in the pit of his stomach that he couldn't ignore. The whispers began shortly after. At first, they were soft, almost indistinguishable from the hum of the house's old pipes. But as the night wore on, they grew louder, clearer. It was as though the walls themselves were speaking, calling out to him from behind the doors. The voices were faint, murmuring his name, soft and seductive, like a lover beckoning him in the dark. "John!" He froze, his breath catching in his throat. "John, come closer." He glanced around, but there was no one in sight. He hadn't heard the door creak, no footsteps echoed on the wooden floors. The mansion had become completely silent again. The whispers had stopped. But then he heard them again, this time from behind a door down the hallway. John felt a chill run through his spine. He recalled rule number 4, if you hear whispering, never follow it. His feet were frozen in place as the whispers beckoned him. The pull was irresistible, like a force was trying to drag him toward the source. He glanced at the door. It looked no different from the others, old, wooden, and shut tight. But that was when something strange happened. The whispering stopped, only to be replaced by the sound of faint breathing. It wasn't just in his mind anymore, it was in the air itself. He could feel it, the presence. Something was in that room. Shaking his head, he forced himself to step back, ignoring the call of the whispers. He couldn't afford to break the rules, not now. He had to stay focused. John turned his back on the door, took a deep breath, and continued his patrol. The weight of the mansion's dark energy hung heavy in the air, but he refused to give in. As the evening drew closer to its end, John found himself in the yard, staring at the massive gates that marked the boundary of the estate. He'd been told to mark a drop of his blood at sundown, but the thought of it felt strange. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It felt as though something deeper was required. There was something almost sacred about it, like his blood was a link to something beyond this world. The sun had set, casting an eerie orange glow across the horizon. He took a small pocket knife out of his bag, the cold steel gleaming in the dim light, and hesitated for a moment. His heart was racing as he sliced the tip of his finger, feeling the sting of the cut. Blood dripped slowly onto the ground in front of the gates, the warm crimson staining the cold stone beneath his feet. John watched as the drop of blood seeped into the earth, feeling an inexplicable weight settling on his chest. He felt it in his bones. The presence of the mansion was growing stronger. It was as if the house was feeding on him, drawing from his essence, binding him to this place. The blood ritual felt unnatural, like he was offering a part of himself to something that would never let him go. He quickly wiped the blood from his finger, tucking the knife back into his pocket. As he turned to go back inside, he glanced at the gates. They stood unmoving, silent, as though they had accepted the offering. But there was something in the air now, a tension, a quiet anticipation. He could almost hear the house breathing along with him, as if it were watching him, waiting. And for the first time, John felt it. The mansion had chosen him. John couldn't help but feel it from the moment he stepped through the front door. The air inside the mansion was thick, heavier than the air outside. It was as if the house was alive, breathing along with him. He had spent the first few hours of his shift walking the halls, getting a feel for the place. It was large, cold, and almost too quiet. There were no signs of life, just ancient portraits hanging on the walls and the whispering sound of the wind outside. But something about the mansion made him feel like he wasn't alone. John stood still for a moment, trying to shake the uneasy feeling crawling up his spine. He couldn't pinpoint it, but something was watching him. It was subtle at first, just a shifting in the shadows or the faintest noise behind him. But as he continued his patrol, the sense of being observed grew. The mansion felt too still, too quiet. As he turned a corner, his footsteps echoing in the silence, he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind him. Nothing, only darkness, but the feeling remained gnawing at his thoughts. Was it paranoia, or was there something in this house, something he couldn't explain? He quickly dismissed it, trying to focus on his job, but the house seemed to shift. The walls didn't seem so still anymore. The air was now thick with tension, like the mansion itself was holding its breath. He felt a pressing weight, as though something unseen was bearing down on him. His hands grew clammy as he continued his walk through the grand hallways, glancing over his shoulder once more. Nothing, but the sensation of being watched never left him. By the time midnight rolled around, John had been patrolling the mansion for several hours, yet the eerie sensation still lingered in the air. He glanced at his watch. It was already late. The mansion, despite its massive size, felt so small and claustrophobic, the walls closing in on him with every step. His flashlight flickered, casting long, jagged shadows against the walls. It was only a brief flicker, but long enough to make John's heart skip a beat. He shook the flashlight, but it flickered again, faint, unreliable, as if it was struggling to maintain its connection to reality. As he continued walking down the hallway, he heard it. The first scream. It was distant, a sharp, blood-curdling cry that seemed to echo from the depths of the mansion. It sent a shock of cold fear through him. His heart pounded in his chest as he rushed towards the sound, convinced that someone was in danger. But the instant he took a step in the direction of the scream, it stopped. The house fell silent again. He glanced around, his eyes wide, searching for the source of the sound. But there was nothing, no one in sight. The hallway was empty, the old portraits still hanging on the walls, their eyes following him as he walked past. The silence that followed was even more unnerving than the scream. John's breath came out in shallow gasps as he tried to rationalize what he had just heard. Was it just his imagination? Had the stress of the job finally gotten to him? He paused for a moment, listening, but there was no more sound. The house was still, too still. He made his way down the hall, nervously checking each door as he passed. But the deeper he ventured into the mansion, the more oppressive the silence became. The mansion was alive, and it was watching him, but there was no one here. Just the faint sound of his own breathing. As John continued down a particularly long hallway, his eyes were drawn to a large antique mirror standing in the middle of the room. The mirror's ornate, gilded frame stood out in stark contrast to the otherwise decrepit surroundings. It was out of place, like something from a different time. There was something strange about it, something that caught his attention in a way he couldn't quite explain. He walked toward the mirror, his footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. As he approached, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, the air thickening with a strange chill. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He couldn't help himself. He felt compelled to look into the mirror. John's reflection stared back at him. At first, it seemed like any normal reflection, his eyes, his face. But as he stood there, something wasn't right. His eyes looked too wide, his face too rigid. The reflection didn't quite match the way he felt, and for a moment he could have sworn his own features began to warp. John felt a strange pull toward the mirror, an overwhelming desire to keep looking, but at the same time a rising sense of dread that made him want to turn away. He remembered the rule, never look in the mirror on Wednesdays. The absurdity of the rule flashed through his mind. Why would a rule like that even exist? It made no sense. Yet, standing before the mirror, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a simple superstition. There was something deeper at play, something far darker. The longer he stared, the more his reflection distorted. His image seemed to flicker, warping and shifting as though the glass itself were alive. His heart raced as the mirror seemed to grow larger, swallowing up the room around him. The coldness in the air intensified, and for a split second he thought he saw movement behind him in the glass. He jerked his head around, but there was nothing. The mirror. It was as if it was beckoning him, drawing him into its depths. A shiver ran down John's spine, and he quickly stepped back. his heartbeat hammering in his chest. He looked away, almost feeling as though something had touched his mind, pushed into his thoughts as he stared into that distorted glass. John took a few hurried steps back from the mirror, the eerie feeling still lingering in the air. He forced himself to look away, shaking his head as if trying to shake off the visions the mirror had shown him. He could still feel it, the pull, the sensation that the mirror had seen him, had marked him in some way. Just a trick of the light, he muttered to himself, trying to calm his nerves. But the coldness in the air, the warping of the reflection, the sense of being watched, none of it felt like coincidence. He had been warned, and he was beginning to understand that in this house nothing was as it seemed. As the days passed, John's sleep grew more erratic. The mansion seemed to pull him into a state of constant unease, its shadowy halls always at the edge of his awareness. The silence that hung around him during his patrols seeped into his mind at night, suffocating him in his sleep. It wasn't long before the dreams began. At first, they were subtle, fleeting, a soft whisper at the edge of consciousness. But then, as the nights wore on, the dreams became vivid, too real. John would wake up gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest, drenched in sweat. The dreams were always the same. He was trapped inside the mansion, running through its endless corridors. No matter how fast he ran, no matter how many doors he opened, he couldn't escape. The walls shifted around him, the house growing larger the more he tried to flee. The hallways stretched into infinity, and with each turn, the unseen force that pursued him grew closer. He could never see its form, but he could feel its presence, a suffocating, oppressive force that was always just behind him. He would try to call out, to scream for help, but his voice would be swallowed by the empty silence of the house. No one would come. And then, just when the darkness was about to consume him, he would wake up in his bed, his heart racing, his body trembling. But the feeling lingered. He couldn't remember how he had gotten back to his bed after the dream. He would lie there, staring up at the ceiling, unsure of whether he was truly awake or still trapped in the nightmare. The sense of disorientation gnawed at him, making his chest tight and his mind fuzzy. Had he been asleep? Had he been walking in the mansion all night? Each morning he would try to shake off the dream, but the sense of dread that followed him throughout the day only grew stronger. He couldn't escape the feeling that the mansion, the very walls around him, was manipulating his mind, drawing him deeper into its grasp. Was it trying to trap him in his sleep? Were the dreams part of its design? Every night it became harder to separate the dreams from reality. The mansion wasn't just a house. It was something far more sinister, and it was wearing him down, bit by bit. As John began to lose himself in the cycle of dreams, waking and working, a terrifying realization started to dawn on him. The rules Father Roderick had imposed upon him, rules that had once seemed nothing more than odd quirks of a private job, were starting to take on a new, disturbing meaning. The rules weren't just about keeping order or structure. They were prisons, boundaries that kept him from something far worse. The house had told him not to look directly into anyone's eyes, not to follow the whispers, not to leave his post after midnight. But as John's exhaustion deepened, he started to question why. What was it about the whispering that terrified him so? Why was it so important that he kept his blood at the gates, marking it at sundown? The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. The mansion itself was not just a physical structure, it was something more, a containment for something old and dark. The mansion was more than just an estate. It was a prison for whatever force was lurking within it, and Father Roderick with his strange rules was its warden. John recalled the look on Father Roderick's face when he spoke of the rules, a look that seemed to say there was more to them than he had been told. The priest's words echoed in his mind. The boundaries are here to protect you. They are not just for trespassers. They keep something much darker contained. As John walked the halls at night, the shifting symbols on the walls seemed to confirm this. They weren't just symbols of some ancient family crest. They were marks of containment, each one a warding spell meant to hold something back. He could feel it in the air, in the density of the house. There was something suffocating about it, something unseen. And the longer he stayed, the more he began to realize that the rules weren't there to protect him from the outside world. They were meant to keep him contained within the house, just like whatever else was trapped inside. He began to fear that the mansion wasn't just a prison for its inhabitants. It was a prison for him too. The rules weren't there to protect him. They were there to prevent him from breaking out. Breaking them would be more than just disobedience. It would be a death sentence. That night, John's patrol took him to the farthest corner of the mansion, where the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The hall was pitch black, and the faint glow of his flashlight barely pierced the oppressive darkness. As he moved deeper into the maze of rooms, the feeling of being watched intensified. The house seemed to shift with him, changing with every step he took. He stopped in front of an old painting that had hung on the wall the night before. Tonight, the image was different. The once tranquil landscape now looked dark and distorted, the colors warped as if the painting was alive. "That's impossible," John whispered to himself, stepping back. His hands shook as he tried to bring the flashlight closer to examine it, but the painting shifted again, this time with the edges curling, like it was trying to escape its frame. His heart raced as he continued his patrol, trying to make sense of the strange occurrences. He passed through several rooms, each one looking more distorted than the last, with objects moving on their own, as if acted upon by invisible hands. Furniture shifted, vases tipped over without any external force. The feeling of unreality grew, and his mind struggled to keep up. John could feel it now. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred. There was no way to tell what was real and what was an illusion. The mansion, the people inside it, the rules, they were all part of something far darker than he could imagine. The house wasn't just changing on the outside, it was twisting his mind, distorting his perception of time and space. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the lack of sleep. Maybe it was the isolation. But deep down, he knew the truth. The mansion was alive and it was playing with his mind. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to keep going. He had to finish his patrol. But with every step, the shadows seemed to stretch farther and farther, wrapping around him like a thick, suffocating fog. He had to keep moving forward. He couldn't afford to stop. Not now, but he could feel it. The mansion was changing him, and he was powerless to stop it. John had been walking through the mansion for what felt like hours when he stumbled upon something that would change everything. In the farthest corner of the estate, beneath a floorboard that creaked with age, he discovered a hidden trapdoor, its surface smooth and dust-free, as if it had been concealed for years, waiting for him to find it. He hesitated for a moment, the darkness of the unknown pulling at his gut. But curiosity won. He crouched down, brushing the dust away from the edges, revealing a rusty iron ring. With a slight groan, he pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading downward. The air was musty and cold, almost as if the very air down there was trapped, sealed away from the rest of the house. The stairs creaked beneath his weight as he descended, and the chill in the air deepened. The light from his flashlight flickered again, casting a brief shadow on the walls. He paused, a shiver crawling down his spine, but pushed forward. At the bottom of the stairs, the tunnel opened into a vast underground room, its ceiling too high for him to see clearly in the gloom. The walls were lined with shelves containing ancient relics, statues, scrolls, and unfamiliar artifacts that seemed to radiate a strange energy. The air smelled of old stone, earth, and something else, something sickly sweet, like incense mixed with rot. The items on the shelves were arranged in a way that didn't seem random. They were placed deliberately, each with a specific purpose. The floor beneath his feet was stone, and the walls were etched with strange symbols that John couldn't recognize. The markings seemed to shift, just like the ones he had seen in the mansion above. As he walked deeper into the room, the air grew heavier, the oppressive feeling from the mansion now magnified tenfold. It felt as though the walls were pressing in on him, the symbols in the stone pulsing with an eerie, almost living energy. At the far end of the room, behind a heavy wooden altar, John noticed a large stone slab, and upon it was a massive carving, a depiction of a creature, half human, half beast, bound in chains. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth frozen in a silent scream. There was something deeply unnatural about the image, as though it had been sculpted to imprison something far worse than anything John could comprehend. The room felt alive, and at that moment, John realized that the mansion wasn't just built on any piece of land. It was built upon sacred ground, ancient and cursed. This land had been hallowed long ago, and for centuries it had been the site of rituals, ceremonies meant to contain something dark, something ancient. He felt the weight of that realization settle on him like a cold, crushing stone. John's eyes darted around the room, his heart pounding. The strange, unearthly atmosphere of the underground chamber seemed to seep into his very soul. His mind raced as he examined the relics. What was this place? Why had it been hidden from the rest of the house? What was its purpose? Near the altar, his gaze caught sight of an old, leather-bound journal sitting on a stone pedestal, as if it had been placed there for him to find. The pages were yellowed and tattered, its ink faded but still legible. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for it, feeling the weight of something sinister pulling at him. The moment his fingers touched the journal, he knew that it held the truth. The cover bore no title, just a single symbol, the same ancient mark that he had seen in the mansion's hallways. It seemed to pulse under his touch. John opened the journal slowly, the pages rustling softly in the otherwise silent room. Father Roderick's handwriting was meticulous, neat, almost too perfect. As John read, the truth behind the mansion and its purpose began to unfold before him. The first few pages detailed Father Roderick's early life, his calling to the priesthood, and his eventual appointment to the mansion. But as he flipped further into the journal, he discovered something far more disturbing. Father Roderick wrote that the mansion had long been the site of secret ceremonies, a tradition passed down through generations. These rituals were meant to protect the world from something dark, something ancient that had been sealed beneath the mansion for centuries. But these rituals weren't just about protection, they were about containment. The entity that was kept within the mansion's walls wasn't some passing threat. It was malevolent, a force that preyed on the souls of anyone who lived there. And the price of keeping it contained was unthinkable. The mansion itself required a constant supply of human energy. It fed on the fear, pain and life force of those trapped inside it. John's heart skipped a beat as he continued reading, the words becoming clearer. Father Roderick had written that the rules weren't just precautions. They were designed to keep the entity at bay. The blood at the gates, the truth spoken within the mansion's walls, the strict boundaries on who could enter and leave, all of it was meant to keep the entity confined, to keep it from breaking free and wreaking havoc on the world. John's mind reeled as the reality of the situation set in. The mansion wasn't just a house. It was a prison, and he had been drawn into it, just like the others who had come before him. As John read the final pages of the journal, his hands began to shake uncontrollably. The truth was clear now. The mansion was more than just a strange, isolated place. It was a sentient entity, one that fed off the energy of those trapped inside it. The mansion's rituals weren't just a safeguard, they were a necessary sacrifice, a way to keep the dark force bound within its walls. Father Roderick's journal ended abruptly, with a chilling final entry. The price of keeping it contained is too high. I fear I may not last much longer. The entity grows stronger with each passing year, and the mansion demands more than we can give. The rules, these rituals, are all that stand between us and the end. I can only pray that the next generation of guardians will be ready to continue the work I have begun. John closed the journal, his mind spinning. He could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The walls around him seemed to close in as the weight of Father Roderick's words pressed down on him. This wasn't just a job. This wasn't just about security. He had become part of something much larger, something darker. The mansion was alive, and it had already marked him as its next sacrifice. The truth was clear. If he stayed, he would feed the dark entity that had haunted this place for centuries. But if he left, would it let him go? John knew one thing for certain. There was no escaping the mansion. The rules were more than just guidelines, they were chains, keeping both him and the malevolent force trapped within its walls. And if he didn't break free soon, he would become just another lost soul, another offering to the mansion's eternal hunger. He had to find a way out before it was too late. It was nearing the end of John's second week at the mansion, and he could feel his grip on reality slipping. The unnerving dreams had intensified, becoming more vivid and real with each passing night. The mansion's walls seemed to press in on him, its dark corners and empty rooms filled with a constant sense of dread. He hadn't told Father Roderick about the visions, or the whispers, or the strange occurrences around the mansion. He hadn't said a word about the secret underground room he had discovered, or the journal that revealed the truth about the mansion's dark history. But Father Roderick, with his old, weathered eyes, had begun to sense that John was no longer just the naive security guard he had once been. One night, just after John had finished his usual patrol, Father Roderick called him into his study. The old priest's face was tired, his hands shaking slightly as he poured himself a cup of tea. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth of the flames did nothing to lift the oppressive chill that hung in the room. Father Roderick gestured for John to sit. "You've been having the dreams, haven't you?" Father Roderick asked, his voice quiet yet heavy with knowing. John swallowed hard. "How do you know?" he asked, his throat tight. The air in the room seemed to grow colder as the priest spoke. "I've seen it before. I've lived through it before," the priest said, his voice laced with a deep, worn sorrow. "It's the mansion. It pulls you in like it does to everyone who comes here. It makes you part of the cycle." John felt a sickening twist in his stomach, the words reverberating in his mind like a warning bell. "The truth is, John," Father Roderick continued, his eyes distant, "this mansion is not just a house. It's an anchor, a prison for something far older, far darker than any of us can comprehend." John's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the priest, waiting for the words to sink in. What was he talking about? Could it be true? Father Roderick set his cup down carefully on the table, and for a long moment he said nothing. The weight of the silence in the room hung like an oppressive fog. Then, with a deep sigh, the priest spoke again. "This place was built long ago, not just to shelter the living, but to serve as a prison." He paused as if gathering his strength. "It holds an entity, a dark force that feeds on the fear and suffering of those trapped within its walls." John's breath caught in his throat. An entity. It sounded like something out of a nightmare, but the priest's expression was grave, his words heavy with truth. "Every night the mansion takes a soul," Father Roderick said quietly, his gaze fixed on John. "A soul is sacrificed to feed the entity. The rules, the rituals, they are all part of keeping it contained, of keeping it from breaking free. And now, John, you've become a part of that cycle. You're the latest offering." John's mind whirled. The rules, the rituals, the bizarre happenings in the mansion. It was all starting to make sense. But the idea that he was the next sacrifice sent a cold shiver down his spine. "The mansion isn't just a house," Father Roderick continued, his voice trembling slightly. "It is a sanctuary, a place of eternal suffering for those bound to its service. The mansion has existed for centuries, kept alive by the souls it consumes. Every guardian who comes here becomes part of the system, a part of the endless cycle of torment." John's eyes went wide as the reality of the situation began to crash down on him. He had never asked for this job. He had never imagined that it would come with such a horrifying price. Father Roderick leaned forward, his tired eyes locking onto John's. "The choice is yours now, John." John sat frozen in his chair, his mind racing as the weight of the priest's words sank in. He tried to make sense of everything. The house, the dreams, the whispers, the blood ritual, it was all connected. The mansion wasn't just a place of employment, it was a prison, and he was its latest captor and prisoner. "You can choose to stay," Father Roderick said, his voice low and filled with quiet desperation. "You can continue to guard the mansion, feed the entity, and serve as its caretaker. You'll live, but you'll never truly escape. Your soul, like all the others, will be trapped here, feeding the entity until it's your turn to be consumed." John swallowed hard. The weight of the decision was suffocating. He had never asked for this job, had never imagined anything like this. He was trapped. There was no way out. Or, Father Roderick said, his voice growing softer, "You can try to escape, but know this, there are consequences. The mansion will never let you leave. It will chase you, haunt you, and eventually it will claim you. The entity will come for you, and it will not rest until it has you, body and soul." John felt a sickening sense of dread gnaw at his insides. The priest's words were like chains locking him in place. The mansion had already consumed so many souls, how could he ever escape? But the thought of continuing in his role as the mansion's guard, feeding the entity with his own life force, seemed like the very definition of hell. Was there even a choice? Father Roderick studied John's face carefully, as if waiting for his response. The air in the room was thick, oppressive, and John's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. John's voice trembled as he finally spoke, his words heavy with uncertainty. "If I leave, if I try to escape, what will happen to me?" Father Roderick's expression grew dark. "It won't be easy, John. The mansion is alive. It won't let you go easily. But you might survive. You might find a way out. Just know this, whatever you choose, it will cost you." John nodded slowly, trying to come to terms with what he was being told. The truth was out in the open now, and he had no idea what his next step would be. As the conversation continued, John felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him: stay and serve the mansion, or run and face the consequences. Neither choice felt right. Both paths led to a lifetime of fear. The priest's words echoed in his mind: "The mansion will claim you." John stood up, his knees shaking, and began to walk toward the door, unsure of what he was about to do. John had grown used to the mansion's unsettling atmosphere, but nothing had prepared him for the moment he came face to face with the dark force that haunted the place. It was late one evening, the moon barely visible behind the heavy clouds, casting the mansion in deep shadows. John was making his way through the labyrinthine hallways, his flashlight flickering as usual. The mansion seemed quieter than usual, the silence broken only by the sound of his footsteps. But as he moved deeper into the corridors, something began to change. It was subtle at first, just a faint whisper, a sound that didn't belong. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, the product of his increasing paranoia. But then it came again, a whisper. It wasn't human, it didn't sound like anything he had ever heard before. It was an unnatural sound, hissing and echoing, as though it was coming from the very walls themselves. The whispers danced on the edges of his hearing, making him strain to understand their words. Release them, break the chains, leave the rules. John's heart pounded as the whispers grew louder. He couldn't make out the words completely, but the suffocating presence that filled the hallway made him feel as though he were drowning in a sea of terror. The air grew heavy, thick with an oppressive force that he couldn't explain. His breath became shallow, and he felt his skin prickle with the sensation that something was watching him. He turned a corner, following the source of the whispers, his flashlight illuminating only darkness. As he reached the end of the hall, something shifted. The shadows seemed to twist unnaturally, pulling toward him, as if the darkness itself had a life of its own. And then, just as he felt his heartbeat thumping in his throat, an icy hand brushed his back. John gasped and spun around, but there was nothing. No one. The hall was empty. The walls were still. The only sound now was the ragged breath coming from his own lungs, but the whispers continued. They were louder now, more insistent, their voices growing darker, more tempting. "Release the rules. You are not bound here. You can be free. Let go of your chains. Break them." John staggered back, the cold chill spreading across his spine. His hands shook as he clutched the flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows in front of him. He took a step back, his mind racing. The whispers were urging him to break the rules, the very rules Father Roderick had set. They were calling to him, coaxing him to abandon the boundaries that had kept him safe, but at what cost? What was he hearing? What was the entity trying to tell him? He could feel the pressure mounting, the presence in the hallway growing stronger. It was here, in the walls, in the shadows, waiting for him to succumb to its will. The following night, John's mind felt fuzzy, his thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. The whispers had come again, echoing in the corners of his mind, urging him to let go. But he had forced himself to keep his head. He was not going to break the rules, no matter how tempting the whispers sounded. Yet, as he continued his patrol, something far darker began to stir. At the stroke of midnight, the mansion changed. The walls, which had always seemed cold and distant, began to feel alive. He could feel them breathing, almost as if they were closing in on him. The air grew colder, and for a moment, John thought he saw something move in the corner of his eye. But when he turned, there was nothing. Only the darkened halls stretching endlessly before him. And then he heard it, screams. They began as a low, almost inaudible wail, but quickly grew into full-throated, primal cries that echoed through the mansion. The screams were not human. They were raw, full of rage and despair, a terrible sound that ripped through the silence like a knife through flesh. John's heart stopped. The screams came from within the walls, from deep within the mansion itself. He tried to move toward them, but his legs wouldn't obey him. It was as if the air itself was pushing against him, holding him back. The sound was too much. It was unbearable. He backed away, his hands trembling, his mind spinning. The screams intensified, filling his ears, and he could feel them burrowing into his brain, consuming his thoughts. "Help! Help me! Let me out!" The voices cried out, but they were not human. There was something otherworldly about them, something inhuman. John had no idea where they were coming from, but the sensation was overwhelming. The screams were the sounds of the trapped souls, the victims of the mansion's endless hunger. It was as if they were calling to him, begging for release. The boundaries between reality and nightmare had already started to blur. And now, he was losing himself completely in the darkness of the mansion. He staggered back down the hallway, his mind spinning with dread. He could feel the house closing in on him, its walls pressing tighter, suffocating him, the cries still ringing in his ears. He had been warned about the rules, but this was something worse. This was the entity, the force that had been feeding off the mansion's inhabitants for centuries, and it was awakening. It was hungry, and it had chosen him as its next victim. John couldn't tell what was real anymore. The mansion was changing before his eyes. It wasn't just the whispers or the screams, it was everything. The walls felt like they were breathing, the shadows stretched and twisted unnaturally, and the air was thick with an oppressive presence. He could feel it closing in on him, suffocating him, and every time he tried to make sense of it, the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. John tried to tell himself that it was just the stress getting to him, that he was just imagining things. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. This place was more than just a mansion. It was alive, and it was feeding on him. The entity wasn't just a force, it was conscious, aware of his every move. It had been watching him since he arrived, waiting for him to break, waiting for him to give in. But John wouldn't give up. Not yet. The whispers had marked him, but they hadn't taken him yet. And he wouldn't let them. Not without a fight. But as he continued down the hall, the walls shifted again and the whispers called louder than ever before. "Release them. Let go. You don't need the rules. You can be free." John stopped, his back against the wall, his breath shallow. The house was closing in. And this time he wasn't sure he could escape. The days bled together for John, the endless march of time becoming nothing more than a haze of dark rooms, cold stone walls, and haunted corridors. It felt as if he were moving through a dream, a nightmare that never truly ended. Every time he woke, it was as if the last several days had vanished in a blur, swallowed by the mansion itself. John could feel himself slipping. He tried to tell himself it was just exhaustion, the strain of the grueling nights, the constant presence of the entity gnawing at the edges of his sanity. But the symptoms kept getting worse. The mansion wasn't just oppressive anymore. It was alive, changing. The walls shifted. The rooms rearranged themselves in ways that defied logic. One moment he would pass through a hallway, and the next time he walked down the same path, it was as if the corridors had expanded or contracted, leading him to new places, places he had never seen before. There was no sense of time. It was as if days and nights bled into one another, indistinguishable. The clock on the wall seemed to move backward, the hand spinning wildly, as if it too was being manipulated by the unseen force that controlled the mansion. He could never tell when he was supposed to sleep or wake. Each time he closed his eyes, he felt as though he had been asleep for weeks. Time didn't exist in the mansion. The creaking of wood beneath his feet followed him everywhere, the sound becoming a constant presence in his mind. Every step he took, every floorboard that groaned under his weight, sent a chill through his spine. The darkness was no longer just an external force. It had become something that was inside him, infiltrating his thoughts, making him question his own perception of the world. He would reach out to touch the walls to steady himself, but they seemed to move away as if to mock him, as if the mansion itself was playing a game with him, a game that he couldn't win. And the whispers, the ever-present whispers, were growing louder. They followed him wherever he went, curling around his mind like the tendrils of a nightmare. The voices seemed to seep through the walls, coming from every corner, every crack in the mansion. They were always there, urging him to give in, to break the rules, to abandon the prison that was slowly consuming him. It's not real, you're not real, break free. The voices promised him peace, offered him freedom. But John knew better. The mansion wasn't offering freedom, it was offering destruction. And yet part of him couldn't help but wonder, was it worth it? Was breaking free worth the price? The thoughts began to spiral, the lines between what was real and what was fantasy blurred more and more. The mansion was no longer just a place, it was a force. It was driving him mad, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. It was one evening just before the witching hour when John could stand it no longer. His sanity had frayed to the point of desperation, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He marched to Father Roderick's study, his heart pounding with both rage and fear. The priest had been a constant in this nightmare. His rules, his prayers, and his calm, detached demeanor had always been a source of comfort for John, even though it felt wrong. But now, John could no longer reconcile what he was feeling with what the priest was telling him. The priest, for all his quiet wisdom, was acting more and more like a spectator in his own house. It was as if Father Roderick had given up, or worse, had become complicit in whatever was happening in the mansion. John barged into the study, the heavy wooden door creaking open with a sense of finality. Father Roderick was sitting at his desk, his head bent over a stack of papers. He didn't even look up when John entered, his eyes still fixed on his work. "Father," John's voice was rough, tinged with panic. "I need to know what's going on. This place, this house, it's changing. I can't even tell if I'm awake anymore, and the whispers, they're getting louder. Please tell me what's happening." Father Roderick didn't flinch, didn't even seem to acknowledge the weight in John's words. He continued writing, his quill moving swiftly across the parchment as though John were just another intrusive noise in his life. "You're hearing things, John," Father Roderick finally said, his voice too calm, too rehearsed. "The mansion plays tricks on you, it will pass." John's frustration boiled over. He slammed his fist on the desk, the sound of the wood reverberating in the small room. "No," he shouted, his voice cracking. "This isn't just in my head, I'm losing my mind. You've known this whole time, haven't you? You've known what this place is, what it's doing to us." For the first time, Father Roderick's gaze lifted from his work, his eyes cold. He didn't seem surprised, nor did he appear concerned. Instead, there was a vague emptiness in his stare, a look as though he had long since accepted his fate. "I've seen it before," Father Roderick replied softly, his voice distant. "This mansion has claimed many souls. It will claim yours, too. It's part of the deal, John, part of the ritual." John recoiled, the words stinging like acid. "What do you mean? What deal? What ritual?" Father Roderick stood slowly, as if weary beyond his years. "This place, this mansion was built to contain the darkness, to keep it at bay. But every 100 years it must feed. It chooses a new soul to offer up. It must have someone to keep it locked away." John's head spun, the weight of the priest's confession crashing into him. He felt the walls closing in, the air growing thick with dread. Father Roderick turned toward the window, his back to John, his hands clasped behind him. "I am part of this cycle. You will be too if you stay. The entity feeds on fear, on suffering. It consumes the soul of each person who remains." John's chest tightened. "And you're just letting it happen." Father Roderick's voice was soft, filled with an eerie resignation. "There is no escape, not for me, not for you." A hollow silence stretched between them as John absorbed the priest's words. In that moment he realized something. The mansion, the entity, the rules, everything had been a trap. And Father Roderick, he had been waiting, like the others, for his inevitable end. John had tried to push it all out of his mind. The whispers, the rules, the ever-present sense of impending doom. But it was no use. Every night the mansion grew more oppressive, more suffocating, and now it seemed to be feeding on his fear, driving him closer to the edge of insanity. It started with the dreams. At first they were vivid flashes, brief, unsettling glimpses into the past. But over time they became more frequent and intense, pulling John deeper into a world he didn't understand. The once familiar corridors of the mansion now stretched endlessly in his mind. He would walk down these halls in his dreams, following their twisting paths, when suddenly the walls would begin to shift, revealing dark, hidden memories. In one of the dreams, John found himself standing in a grand but decaying ballroom. The walls were lined with ancient portraits, their eyes watching him, following his every move. As he approached the center of the room, he saw a figure standing in the shadows, a man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. He stepped closer, but as he did, the man's face contorted in pain. His skin began to rot away, revealing decayed bones beneath, and his mouth opened to reveal a chilling, silent scream. "Help me! Release me!" The figure seemed to whisper, but it wasn't his voice. It was the voice of someone long dead, someone who had served the mansion before him. Suddenly, John was pulled forward, stumbling across the ballroom floor. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, and the room seemed to stretch out infinitely. He saw more faces in the walls, twisted and warped, their bodies contorted in agony. They all wore the same expression: suffering. They had been here before him, just like the countless others who had come and gone, guardians who had tried and failed to escape the mansion's grasp. With a sickening jolt, John woke up, his heart pounding in his chest. His room was still, but the shadows seemed thicker, the air heavier. The whispers still lingered in his mind, and the faces, those haunting, hollow faces, seemed to stare at him from the edges of his consciousness. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were trying to communicate with him, to warn him. Each night the visions grew stronger. The faces from the walls appeared more vivid, more desperate. John saw the bodies of previous guardians, twisted, decayed, and broken. Their eyes were wide with terror, but their spirits were trapped, bound to the mansion by the same force that had ensnared him. John began to understand. The mansion wasn't just a house, it was a graveyard, a prison for the souls of the lost, the tormented guardians who had sacrificed their lives to keep the entity contained. Each one of them had left an imprint on the walls, a memory that the entity fed on to grow stronger. And John was next. It wasn't just the visions. The mansion itself seemed to shift around him, responding to his growing sense of paranoia and desperation. The walls felt like they were breathing, the air thick with something he couldn't explain. The house had become a living, breathing entity in itself, a part of the darkness that had consumed everything within. John's nightly patrols grew more and more unbearable. Every corner he turned, every door he opened, felt like he was walking deeper into a labyrinth with no escape. The mansion shifted around him, its rooms rearranging themselves at will, forcing him to confront the same impossible hallways and stairwells over and over again. He saw faces in the mirrors, not his own, but the faces of the previous guardians, their expressions frozen in agony. They seemed to follow him, their eyes haunting, their mouths moving soundlessly as if they were trying to scream. But no sound came. "Get out, before it's too late." One of the faces whispered, its eyes wide with terror. John stumbled back, his heart racing. The house felt as if it were closing in on him, trapping him within its clutches. The walls groaned and creaked as if they were alive, watching him, waiting for him to break. And it wasn't just the mirrors. The shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching and pulling, trying to trap him in their dark embrace. He could hear footsteps behind him, whispers in the walls, faint scratching sounds that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The mansion was alive, and it was trying to consume him. But it wasn't just the house itself. John could feel the presence of the entity. It was growing stronger, feeding off his fear, growing more powerful with every passing day. It whispered to him at night, promising him freedom, tempting him with the idea that if he let go, he could escape the mansion's grip. But John knew better. The entity wasn't offering freedom. It was offering destruction. As the days turned to weeks, John began to lose track of time. The mansion had become his only reality, and the lines between dream and nightmare began to blur. He couldn't remember if he was still awake or if he had slipped into the dreamscape of the mansion, where the walls held the souls of the lost. Each moment felt like he was slipping further into the abyss, and the whispers, the voices, grew louder. They were no longer just urging him to break the rules. They were calling to him, claiming him. "It's too late. You've already given in," they whispered, as John felt the walls close in on him. The mansion had been wearing him down, both mentally and physically. Each passing day felt like an endless cycle, with the same oppressive atmosphere, the same tormenting whispers, and the same eerie rules. John could feel the boundaries that Father Roderick had set around him growing more and more like chains, rules that weren't just to protect him, but to trap him in the mansion's suffocating grasp. But now, the rules were beginning to feel less like safety and more like a prison. The first rule had always been the most difficult to bear. Never look directly into anyone's eyes, especially not the inhabitants of the mansion, those mysterious, unnerving figures that lurked in the corners, in the hallways, and in the shadows. The rule seemed harmless at first. Just keep your gaze on the floor or the walls, avoid eye contact, and all would be well. But now, John found himself questioning its true purpose. What was the real danger of looking into the eyes of those creatures? Could the mansion's power really be so fragile that a mere glance could destroy it? The whispers had been getting louder, more insistent. They urged him to look into the eyes of the entity, to break the rule and free himself from the torment he had been enduring. They promised him freedom, a life without the constant fear, the dread that came with every second spent in the mansion. It would all be over if he simply abandoned the rule, abandoned the chain that held him captive. John's mind was teetering on the edge. What was the worst that could happen? And then there was the mirror in the chapel. He had seen it before on his nightly patrols. It was always there, hanging perfectly still, its dark surface reflecting nothing but the shadows of the room. He had avoided it out of respect for the rules Father Roderick had laid out. But now, every time he passed the mirror, he felt an unnatural pull toward it, a compulsion to look. It wasn't like the other mirrors in the mansion. This one was different. Its surface seemed to call to him like a siren's song, drawing him into its depths. And the whispers, they had begun to speak more clearly, encouraging him, almost begging him to look. Just one look, John. One look is all it takes. You'll be free. The temptation was overwhelming. The longer he fought against it, the harder it became to resist. Every corner he turned, every time he saw his reflection in the glass, he felt the pull growing stronger. And then one evening, when the mansion was eerily silent, when the oppressive weight of the air had grown almost unbearable, John found himself standing in front of the mirror. The whispers had led him here. The temptation had led him here. Without thinking, he stepped closer to the glass, his heart pounding in his chest. His breath fogged up the surface, and for a brief moment he saw his reflection. But it wasn't just his own face staring back at him. The image in the mirror was warped, distorted as if something other was looking through the glass. And then he saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, inhuman and ancient, staring back at him through the reflection. They weren't his eyes, they were the eyes of something far darker, a presence that had been watching him all along, waiting for this very moment. "You've finally come," the whisper echoed as though coming from deep within the mirror. John felt his body freeze. The eyes in the glass didn't blink, didn't look away. They pierced him. And for the first time, he understood the true power of the entity. He had crossed the line. There was no going back now. John had been warned. The rules were there to protect him. But in that moment, standing in front of the mirror, he felt the weight of the mansion's power closing in on him, pressing down on him. The entity was real. It had been watching him. And now it was here, waiting for him to make his choice. The ground beneath John's feet seemed to shift as he stepped away from the mirror, unable to pull his eyes away from the reflection that continued to stare at him. He heard the whispers again, louder now, closer, wrapping around his mind. "You've broken the rules, John. You're mine now, forever." Before he could react, the air around him froze and the temperature in the room dropped to an impossible low. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows in the corners moving as if alive. John felt a chill creep into his bones as the entity's form began to materialize before him. It was no longer just a whisper, no longer a voice in his head. It was here in the room with him, and it was far more terrifying than he could have imagined. The entity was monstrous, its form shifting between human and something far older, far more ancient. Its body seemed to twist in unnatural ways, its skin a patchwork of darkness, its eyes glowing like burning coals. It towered over John, its presence suffocating, filling the room with an oppressive force. John tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. He had no words. The entity was real. The house, the rules, the prison, it had all been for this moment. The entity had been waiting for him to break, to succumb to the temptation. "You've been a good boy, John." The entity's voice rumbled deep and hollow, "but now it's time to choose. Join me and you will never suffer again. You will have everything you desire. Power, freedom, immortality. The offer was tempting, too tempting. John could feel the pull of the entity's words. He had been living in torment for so long, desperate for escape. The idea of leaving all the pain, all the fear behind was almost irresistible. But then he remembered the faces, the souls trapped in the mansion, the guardians who had come before him, each one lost to the mansion's hunger. He remembered the tormented deaths he had witnessed in his dreams, the screams of those who had sacrificed their lives to keep the entity contained. John's mind raced, and for the first time since he arrived, he felt the full weight of the decision before him. Freedom or destruction? The entity loomed closer, its glowing eyes fixed on him, waiting for his answer. The air was thick with tension, and John felt himself on the edge, teetering between two worlds, one of eternal torment and the other of damnation. And in that moment, as he looked into the entity's eyes, John made his choice. John's heart pounded in his chest as he stood in front of the entity, its towering, shadowy form looming over him. The air in the room was thick with tension, the atmosphere charged with an otherworldly force that made him feel as though he was suffocating. He had been offered a choice, freedom, but at what cost? The entity's voice was a low, gravelly hum that seemed to penetrate the very fabric of his thoughts. It was insistent, soothing in its promises, yet undeniably dark in its intentions. "You've struggled, John. I see the torment you've endured." It purred, its voice like an oppressive weight pressing on his mind. "But now I offer you a way out, freedom from this prison. Freedom from the walls that close in on you, from the rules that bind you to this place." John's thoughts were a whirlwind. He had spent weeks trapped within the mansion, fighting against the rules, the whispers, the entity's insidious influence. The mansion had been slowly eating away at his sanity, and the thought of escaping, of being free from this eternal nightmare, was so tempting it nearly overwhelmed him. The entity continued, sensing his inner turmoil. "In exchange for your soul, your sanity, and your servitude, I can grant you the one thing you desire most: freedom. You will be released from this house, free to roam the world, free to live forever with unimaginable power at your command." The offer was intoxicating. Eternal life, freedom from the mansion, and the promise of power. No more rules, no more torment, no more darkness, just endless possibilities. The entity's words echoed in John's mind, tempting him, promising everything he had ever wanted but never thought he could have. But the price, the cost, was steep. He would have to give up his soul to serve the entity in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. His mind fought to reconcile the offer. Could he trust it? Could he really accept such a horrifying price for freedom? John found himself torn. The idea of freedom, the temptation of release from the mansion's clutches, was almost more than he could bear. But something in him hesitated. The entity's promises were seductive, but they felt too easy. Nothing this powerful could come without consequences. As he stood there, fighting his own internal battle, the entity sensed his reluctance, its gaze intensifying. "You are weak, John. You are close to breaking. I see it in your eyes." The entity's form seemed to shift, flickering between human and something much darker, more ancient. "This is your chance. All I ask is for a small sacrifice. Your blood, a simple offering, and I will set you free." The entity's words seemed to linger in the air like a dark invitation. It wasn't just freedom it promised, it was immortality, the power to control his own destiny. The price, however, was not something he could take lightly. "A blood sacrifice," the entity repeated, its voice insistent and cold. "A small token to prove your commitment. The rules are clear. A servant's bond is sealed with blood. Show me your devotion, and I will grant you the freedom you seek." John stared at the entity, his heart racing in his chest. The blood ritual was something he had seen the previous guardians perform during his first few nights in the mansion, though it had always seemed like some ancient superstition, something distant and foreign, disconnected from his own world. But now, standing before the entity, he realized that this was not a superstition. This was real. The ritual was an unavoidable step in his offering, a necessary act to bind him to the entity, to become part of its eternal cycle. The entity held out a darkly shimmering hand, its fingers elongated and sharp like claws. Red energy crackled in the air between them, swirling like a storm, as if the very room was alive with dark energy. John's gaze dropped to his own hands. The temptation was overwhelming. His hands were shaking. The entity's promise of freedom, of an end to the madness, was almost too much to resist. But in the back of his mind, a small voice screamed at him. This was wrong. Everything about this felt wrong. But the whispers, those voices that had been guiding him for so long, suddenly seemed to fade, replaced by the entity's unyielding offer. This is your only way out. This is how it must be. Sacrifice yourself now, and you will finally be free. With a deep breath, John felt the pull of the mansion, of the entity drawing him in. He had become so entangled in the mansion's darkness that he was almost willing to give in. Almost. Without thinking, he grabbed a shard of broken glass from a nearby table. His hand was steady, though his pulse was a chaotic mess of fear and desire. The cut was sharp, the sting of the glass slicing through his skin, but it was almost too easy, a small offering, a simple offering to prove his loyalty. Blood poured out from the wound, dripping onto the floor in a slow, steady stream. As he felt his blood spill, John felt a strange connection to the entity, like something ancient had been awakened within him. "Yes," the entity whispered in exultation, "that's it. You are mine now. Your sacrifice is complete." John winced, feeling the sting of the wound in his palm, but something else, the weight of the decision, pressed down on him. As the blood continued to drip onto the cold floor, he felt a shift within himself. His heartbeat slowed, and the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, thicker. The walls seemed to close in on him, and a sickening dread filled his chest. But something was wrong. The freedom he had been promised, the peace he thought he would find, had been replaced by a deep, consuming darkness. As he looked up, the entity's eyes seemed to glow brighter, its presence expanding, filling the room like a suffocating fog. John had made the decision to break the rules, to serve the entity in exchange for his freedom. But now, he realized with a sickening clarity, freedom had never been part of the bargain. John's mind was a battlefield, every thought a war between fear and defiance. He had already sacrificed so much, the blood sacrifice, the bending of the rules, the acceptance of the entity's power. But something inside him refused to go any further. The entity's promises of freedom, immortality, and power were no longer enough to keep him in its grasp. John knew that the final rule, the one that had haunted him from the beginning, the one Father Roderick had spoken about in whispered tones, was the ultimate test. Rule 6, never turn your back on the entity. It was the last piece of the puzzle, the final bond that would keep him trapped forever within the mansion's walls. But enough was enough. He had spent too many days, too many nights staring into the entity's glowing eyes, feeling the weight of its promises dragging him deeper into its web. The mansion had become a nightmare, a prison made of flesh and blood. Every part of it was a trap, every whisper a lie. But in this final moment, John made the decision that would change everything. "I refuse," he whispered, his voice trembling but firm. He could feel the entity's presence pressing on him, tightening its grip. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, and the shadows around him seemed to shift, as if watching, waiting. But John's resolve only grew stronger. He stepped away from the entity, his heart pounding. His hand trembled as he slowly turned his back on the monstrous force that had tormented him. He had rejected its offer, rejected everything it had promised him. With that single act of defiance, he broke the final rule. The moment John turned away, the world around him began to shudder. The floor beneath his feet vibrated with a terrible energy, and the walls, which had once seemed so solid and unyielding, began to shake violently. The mansion groaned in agony, its bones creaking and cracking as if something deep within it was splitting apart. The air turned suffocating. It felt like the very foundation of the house was being torn from beneath him. The once grand hallways twisted into nightmarish shapes, the floors buckled beneath his weight, and the walls seemed to melt into liquid shadows, stretching and distorting. The ceiling cracked open in places, and the mansion itself seemed to shudder in pain, like a dying creature. John's heart raced as he tried to find his bearings. The house was rejecting him. He could feel it in the air, in the very walls around him. The mansion had been built to trap souls. His soul was now rejecting the mansion, and with that rejection, the house began to fall apart. John ran down the hall, the walls bending and shifting, as if the mansion were trying to swallow him whole. Every turn seemed to lead him deeper into a maze of distorted rooms and collapsing hallways. The ground shook beneath him, causing him to stumble and nearly fall. He heard the screams of the past guardians, their voices echoing through the walls. "You can't escape," one of them screamed. "We tried to run and we failed," another cried out in desperation. The warnings echoed in John's ears, but he didn't stop. The fear of being trapped forever, of losing his soul to the entity, drove him to push forward, running through the shifting corridors with only one thought in mind: escape. But the mansion wasn't going to let him go so easily. The very walls seemed to bend and twist, shifting in unnatural ways to block his path. Doors slammed shut, trapping him in rooms that seemed to expand and contract with each passing second. The house was alive, and it was fighting back. As John stumbled through the corridors, the voices of the previous guardians grew louder, their wails and cries becoming a cacophony that drowned out everything else. They warned him, begged him to turn back, to give up his escape. "You cannot outrun it," one voice pleaded, its tone filled with despair. "We tried, we ran, and the mansion consumed us. You cannot escape the price of breaking the rules." Another voice screamed, its tone raw with pain. "The mansion will claim you just as it claimed us." John's breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed forward, his feet slipping on the crumbling floor. The walls seemed to stretch out endlessly, each step he took only leading him deeper into the twisting maze. He could feel the house closing in on him, its shadows reaching out to grab him. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He had to get out, no matter what the cost. But the house wasn't going to let him go that easily. As he rounded another corner, he found himself back at the front entrance, but it looked different. The door was barricaded, and the windows were shattered. The outside world seemed so far away, as if he had been running in circles. The mansion was playing with him, toying with his mind. He heard the entity's voice again, this time louder, more insistent. "You cannot leave, John. You belong to me now. You are mine." John's heart raced. He could feel the presence of the entity closing in on him, its power suffocating him. But he couldn't give up now. He couldn't turn back. With a final, desperate push, John threw himself against the door, his shoulder slamming into it with all his might. The wood cracked, splintering beneath the force of his body, and the door gave way with a final, echoing groan. John stumbled out of the mansion, gasping for air as he collapsed on the ground. The world outside seemed so much brighter, the air fresher, but it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a temporary escape, one that would only last as long as the mansion allowed it. Behind him, the mansion began to collapse in on itself. The walls cracked and crumbled, the shadows shifting and twisting as the mansion seemed to tear itself apart. The entity's rage was palpable in the air, but John didn't turn back. He couldn't. He had made his choice, and now there was no turning back. As he staggered away from the ruins of the mansion, the whispers of the past guardians echoed in his mind. "You're free for now." John stumbled away from the ruins of the mansion, his body aching, his mind swirling in a haze of disbelief. He had escaped, or so he thought. His legs felt weak beneath him, but adrenaline and the need for freedom pushed him forward. As he reached the edge of the mansion's grounds, the world outside felt almost foreign, so much brighter, so much fresher than the suffocating darkness he had left behind. He stood on the open road, the night air crisp against his skin, and he thought for a fleeting moment that he might actually be free. But something in him felt wrong, like a shadow following in his footsteps. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, a sense of being watched, a sensation that gnawed at his very bones. He glanced back over his shoulder, expecting nothing more than the ruins of the mansion, but his heart skipped a beat when he saw it. The mansion was still there, standing impossibly tall against the dark sky. The walls were cracked, the windows shattered, but there it was watching him. He could feel its presence like a weight on his chest, a palpable force that seemed to seep into the very fabric of his mind. It wasn't just a house anymore. It had become a part of him, and now it followed him no matter how far he ran. "You cannot escape." The words echoed in his mind, a cold whisper carried on the wind. John's heart thudded in his chest as he turned and started to run, his feet pounding against the pavement. The road stretched out before him, dark and endless, but the nagging sense of the mansion's eyes, watching, following, never leaving him, never faded. It wasn't just a physical presence. It was an emotional one, an oppressive weight that made him feel trapped even in the wide open world. Days passed, but no matter how far John traveled, he couldn't shake the feeling of the mansion looming just beyond the horizon. It was always there, following him, as if the house had anchored itself to his very being. It was as though the walls of the mansion had merged with his mind, each step he took carrying a trace of the entity's curse with him. John tried to move on, telling himself that maybe it was all just a nightmare, that he had only imagined the mansion's power, that he had broken free finally. He tried to drown the memories in distractions, new places, new faces, even new jobs. But wherever he went, the whispers followed. In his dreams, the mansion's dark presence came to life once more. The walls would close in, the air would grow cold, and he would feel the same weight on his chest, the same suffocating feeling of being trapped. The mansion's voice would echo in his mind, even when he was wide awake. "You can't hide. You can't run. You belong to me." The whispers were soft, coaxing, like the pull of a long-forgotten memory, always just out of reach but undeniably real. John could feel the entity's hunger in the air, like it was feeding on his fear, feeding on the guilt of breaking the rules. It was inside him now, gnawing at the edges of his sanity, a constant presence that wouldn't let him forget. No matter where he went, he felt the mansion's gaze, an oppressive force that seemed to stretch across the distance, as if it were tied to his very soul. Every night, as he closed his eyes, he would see the dark halls, hear the whispers, and feel the shifting shadows of the mansion pressing in on him. And with each passing day, John realized that the mansion's influence wasn't something he could outrun. It wasn't just a place. It was a curse, something that had marked him the moment he stepped foot inside. John couldn't escape it. The entity's grip was tighter than ever. Wherever he went, the mansion would follow, waiting for him to return. One night, after weeks of restless sleep and the constant pull of the mansion's power, John found himself standing at the edge of a small town. It was a place he had never been before, quiet, peaceful, with the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the sidewalk. He had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that this would be the place where the mansion could no longer find him. But as he stood there, staring down the empty street, he saw something in the distance. It was familiar. Through the foggy night air he saw it, the faint outline of the mansion, its towering spires silhouetted against the sky, the same looming presence that had haunted him for months. It was impossible. He couldn't be seeing this. He had traveled across the country, moved into a new place, changed his life. And yet there it was, standing in the distance, waiting. The mansion's eyes were always watching. John collapsed to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the weight of the situation finally hit him. There was no running. There was no escaping. He had never truly left the mansion. It had followed him, silently, patiently, and now it would never let him go. John's attempts to escape the mansion's influence had been futile. He had traveled far, changing his life and seeking solace in unfamiliar places. But the further he tried to run, the tighter the grip of the mansion became. It was an illusion, the idea that he could outrun it, that he could leave it behind. No matter how many miles he put between himself and the mansion, it followed him, ever present in his mind, like an ancient curse that would never release its hold. John felt its presence at all times. He could sense the mansion's eyes on him, even when he was surrounded by strangers in bustling cities or quiet, peaceful towns. The house's influence stretched across the distance, like invisible chains that bound him to its dark core. It was as though the mansion was not just a building, but a living force, one that could bend time and space to its will. The whispers began again, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing day. It was as though the walls of the mansion were echoing in his mind, calling to him, pulling him back toward its sinister embrace. The voices were no longer just distant echoes. They felt close, as though they were right beside him, whispering in his ears, urging him to return. "You can't run, John. You never could." The chill of the mansion's presence seeped into his bones. It wasn't just the haunting dreams he experienced, where the mansion's dark corridors seemed to stretch forever, or the strange visions of its walls that he saw when his eyes were closed. It was more than that. It was the overwhelming sense that something was still inside him, clinging to him, a presence that would never let go. John's mind began to fracture. He couldn't tell where reality ended and the nightmares began. He was trapped in a never-ending cycle of fear and suffering, as the mansion's influence twisted everything he knew into something unrecognizable. He felt as if he were walking through fog, always just a step away from sanity, never truly free from the mansion's grasp. One particularly restless night, after a dream so vivid and oppressive that it left John shaking upon waking, he found himself standing in front of the mansion once more. It was impossible. He had left. He had run as far as he could, but here it was again, towering before him in the darkness. Its stone facade loomed like a living thing, as if it had always been waiting for him, calling him back to its heart. The sensation was overwhelming, like a magnetic pull drawing him in. No matter how hard he fought, no matter how far he had gone, John knew in that instant that he was trapped. The mansion was not just a place. It was within him, a part of his soul, and now it was calling him home. The air around him felt heavy, oppressive, and he could almost hear the mansion's whispers, beckoning him to come closer. "You never left, John. You can never leave." It was a truth he could no longer deny. In a daze, John stepped forward, his legs moving on their own accord, drawn to the mansion's doors as if he were a puppet and the mansion its master. He tried to fight it, tried to break free, but the force pulling him was irresistible. As he crossed the threshold, he felt an eerie sense of déjà vu. It was as if he had never left this place at all. The air was thick with a familiar weight, the same oppressive feeling he had carried with him since the moment he first set foot in the mansion. Inside, the mansion was unchanged, as if the months of his absence had never occurred. The same old, dark corridors stretched before him, the same haunting whispers filled the air. The walls seemed to move, shifting slightly as if they had been waiting for him to return. The ceiling groaned under an invisible weight, and the flickering lights cast long, twisted shadows that crawled across the floor like living things. John tried to speak, to scream, but the words caught in his throat. The mansion's power was overwhelming, suffocating. He had broken the rules. He had tried to leave. He had tried to escape the entity's grasp, but now he realized that there was no escape. The mansion had always owned him, and he had never truly left its grasp. John wandered through the halls, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He felt as though he were walking through the mansion in a dream, as though he were trapped between two worlds. The entity's presence was everywhere. It was in the walls, the air, the shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. It was as if the mansion had consumed everything around him, his memories, his sense of time, even his own identity. The whispers were louder now, swirling around him like a storm. They were no longer distant. They were right beside him, in his mind, in his ears. He could hear the voices of the previous guardians, their voices full of despair and regret, urging him to turn back. "You can't escape, John. You never could." The entity was not just a presence. It was a force, a living, breathing thing that had existed long before John ever set foot in the mansion. It had fed on fear, on suffering, on the very souls of those trapped inside its walls. And now it would feed on him. John's heart raced as he realized the true nature of the mansion. It was not just a prison for the soul. It was a gateway, a portal to something far darker and more ancient than he could ever understand. It had always been waiting for him, watching him, pulling him back into its clutches. The mansion had claimed him, body and soul. There was no escape. John's mind had become a battleground, torn between the terror of the mansion and the tempting offer presented to him. The entity had been with him for so long, whispering in his ears, twisting his thoughts, making him doubt his own sanity. But now, standing in the heart of the mansion, with the walls shifting and the air thick with its presence, the entity spoke to him one final time. Its voice was both soothing and terrifying, a perfect mixture of promise and dread. It was as if the mansion itself was alive, speaking directly through the entity's words. "John," the voice echoed, smooth and silken, yet filled with a dark promise. "You have fought me, resisted me, and yet here you stand, still bound to my will. You cannot escape me no matter where you go. I am the mansion and the mansion is me. Together we are one." John felt his body shiver, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had been running, fighting, desperately seeking a way out. But now the entity had cornered him. There was no more running, no more hiding. The mansion held him, the entity controlled him, and now it offered him one final chance. "Join me," it whispered, its voice alluring like a serpent wrapping around his mind. "I can end your suffering, John. I can make it all stop. You will never have to fear me again. The mansion will be yours to command. Become my ultimate guardian, and I will grant you power beyond your wildest dreams." John's heart pounded in his chest. Eternal power, the mansion would be his, and he would be its master. The entity promised an end to his torment, an end to the endless whispers, the visions, the nightmares. It sounded like the perfect escape. All he had to do was submit, to embrace the entity and give in to its dark will. "Think about it, John," the entity coaxed, its voice now gentler, more persuasive. "You will be free. You will rule this place, and no one will ever escape again. You will finally have control." John closed his eyes, trying to push the tempting thoughts from his mind. Freedom, power. He had spent so long fighting, so long yearning for an escape. The mansion had twisted everything, fed on his fear, and now it was offering him everything he had ever wanted. The power to end the torment, to control the mansion, to destroy the cycle. But John knew deep down that if he accepted the entity's offer, he would be lost forever. He would never be the man he once was. His humanity would fade into the shadows, consumed by the mansion's power. The entity promised him eternal reign, but at the cost of his soul. He would become a puppet, bound to the mansion forever, a mere instrument in its dark design. John's mind raced. The temptation was so powerful, the allure of freedom and power whispering in his ear. But as he stood there facing the entity, he remembered everything he had lost: his sanity, his humanity, the time he had spent running from the mansion's grip. He remembered the suffering of the other guardians, the souls who had been consumed and lost within the mansion's walls, their fates sealed by the same choice he now faced. John looked inside himself, searching for the last shred of humanity he had left. He could feel the darkness closing in, the mansion pressing against him, but there was still a glimmer of something pure inside him, a spark of resistance that refused to fade. "I won't be like them," John thought, his resolve growing stronger. "I won't be swallowed up by the mansion. I will fight until the end." With every ounce of his strength, John resisted the pull of the entity. The whispers grew louder, the air heavier, but he stood firm. He would not let the mansion claim him. He would not let the entity win. He looked directly into the darkness that surrounded him, the place where the entity's power was strongest, and he spoke with clarity and defiance. "No," he said, his voice steady. "I refuse." The entity's form trembled. The mansion's walls groaned as though the entire structure were reeling from the rejection. For a moment, everything went still. The whispers faded. The power that had held John captive for so long seemed to falter, but only for an instant. "You cannot escape," the entity hissed, its voice now twisted with rage. "You belong to me. You always have. There is no running from me." But John, in his final moment of clarity, made a choice. He would destroy the mansion. He would not give in to the entity's power. He would end the cycle, no matter the cost. John's heart raced, and his body surged with the adrenaline of his final decision. He turned away from the entity, feeling the mansion's walls shudder in response. The very air around him seemed to crackle with dark energy. The mansion itself was fighting back, trying to force him back, to make him submit to its will. But John pushed forward. He knew what he had to do. He had to destroy the mansion from the inside. He had to sever the unseen chains that had bound him to it, to break the mansion's power forever. As he made his way to the heart of the mansion, the place where the entity's power was strongest, John could feel the walls closing in, the shadows creeping ever closer. The whispers were deafening, urging him to turn back to accept the entity's offer, but he ignored them. He focused only on his goal, destroying the mansion, ending the curse. With one final act of defiance, John broke the mansion's heart. He shattered the source of the entity's power, causing the mansion to collapse in on itself. The walls crumbling, the shadows dissipating, the entity's power breaking apart. John stood at the gates of the mansion, staring at the smoldering ruins. The once grand estate, a symbol of his torment and entrapment, now lay in crumbled pieces around him. The walls that had held so much darkness and power were reduced to nothing but debris. Yet, despite the physical destruction, the sense of weight and oppression lingered in the air. His body was still intact, free from the physical chains the mansion had bound him with. But his mind was a different matter. The mansion's horrors, the entity's whispers, the unbearable weight of the rules had left their mark on him. He couldn't help but feel the fractures in his own sanity, the cracks that had formed during his time trapped within its walls. The mansion's power wasn't just in its physical form, it had woven itself into the very fabric of his mind. He had fought, he had broken free, and yet something was missing. Was he truly free? Could he ever be? Or had the mansion's influence seeped so deep into his soul that freedom was now a distant, impossible dream? John took a deep breath, his heart heavy with the burden of his choices. He had destroyed the mansion. He had defied the entity. But as he stood in the silence, looking at the ruins, he realized that the battle was far from over. The mansion might be gone, but its darkness still lingered in the corners of his mind, like a shadow that would never leave. As John began to walk away from the ruins, he heard the whispers again. At first, they were faint, distant, just like before, like the soft rustling of wind through the trees. But then, as he walked further, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, and he realized with a chilling shock that the voices weren't coming from the ruins. They weren't coming from the mansion anymore. The whispers were inside him. John froze in his tracks, his blood running cold. The voice was unmistakable, the entity's voice, but it was no longer an external presence. It was in his head, a constant murmur, a maddening reminder of everything he had been through. "You cannot escape, John, you never did." His stomach churned as he fought to push the words from his mind. But the more he tried to silence them, the louder they became, reverberating through his thoughts, his very being. It was then that he realized he had never truly left the mansion. Its power wasn't in the building. It wasn't bound to its walls or its rooms. The entity had seeped into his soul, and now it was part of him. The mansion wasn't just an external prison. It was inside him, alive within his mind, a constant presence that would never fade. John began to walk again, his footsteps heavy with the weight of his realization. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching into the horizon, but every step felt like he was walking further into the darkness. The mansion was no longer a place. It was a feeling, an energy that he carried with him. It had become his personal torment, an unshakable weight that followed him wherever he went. As he walked, the whispers continued, now entwined with his thoughts as if the mansion's spirit had claimed his mind. The soft rustling of the leaves in the wind now sounded like voices, the faint hum of the world around him twisted into something unnatural. No matter how far he walked, He couldn't escape the feeling that the mansion was still there, watching him, waiting for him to return. "You are mine." The whispers coiled around his thoughts, taunting him. "You will always be mine." John didn't know where the road would lead him. He didn't know if he would ever find peace. But as he took each step forward, the mansion seemed to follow, lurking in the background, always just beyond his reach but ever present in his mind. The final image is of John walking away from the ruins of the mansion, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. He could feel the mansion's gaze on him, even though it was no longer there, no longer physically present. It was as though the mansion itself had become a part of him, an indelible mark on his soul that he could never erase. As he walked into the distance, the whispers grew softer but never stopped. They were always there, always just beneath the surface, a reminder that the mansion had never truly been destroyed. It had only shifted, and now it resided within him. The mansion was no longer just a place. It was a memory. It was a part of John, a part of his mind, his soul. The cycle had never ended. It would continue just as it always had forever. The mansion and the entity within it were eternal, and now so was John, bound to them whether he liked it or not. The story ends with John's footsteps fading into the distance, the mansion still watching, still waiting. Because some traps, no matter how far you run, can never be escaped.